Good evening and welcome to NTD UK News. I'm Stuart Lees. Tonight's top story. The Chancellor unveils the budget for what he calls a new age of optimism for the UK. He announced a big boost in public spending and pledged lower taxes before the next election. Also tonight, bad news for Prime Minister Boris Johnson, as a new poll shows the public want a referendum on his net zero proposals. And after 16 years in power, Angela Merkel is no longer Germany's Chancellor. The president formally dismissed her today, but asked her to stay on in a caretaker role until a new German government is formed. Chancellor Rishi Sunak unveils the budget amid predictions that the economy will recover better than expected. He announced what he called the largest increase in spending this century across government departments, as well as more investment in the NHS and millions of workers getting a pay rise. NTD's Jane Worrell has more from London.
Posing for the traditional photograph with the red budget box, the Chancellor prepares to announce his spending plans. During his 70-minute speech, he admitted an increase in inflation and rising taxes.
Taxes are rising to their highest level as a percentage of GDP since the 1950s. I don't like it, but I cannot apologise for it. It is the result of the unprecedented crisis we faced and the extraordinary action we took in response.
His big spending plans had some compare him to Labour leaders Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, but he said he wants it to be temporary, pledging lower taxes before the end of the Parliament. His plans include a rise in overall spending for government departments, totalling £150 billion over the course of this Parliament, £5.9 billion to NHS England, a rise in the minimum wage to £9.50 per hour, as well as investment in different sectors including education, transport and science. Other measures include a freeze on fuel duty, cuts to air passenger duty for domestic flights, a scrapping of planned increases to business rates in England, and plans to radically simplify alcohol tax so that it's based on the alcoholic strength of the drink.
Fuel duty, cut. Air passenger duty, cut. Alcohol duty, cut. The biggest cut to business rates in 30 years. Growth up. Jobs up. Wages up. Public finances back in a better place. More investment in infrastructure, innovation and skills. A pay rise for over 2 million people and a £2 billion tax cut for the lowest paid. This budget helps with the cost of living.
Opposition, the Shadow Chancellor, Rachel Reeves.
From the other side of the benches, a strong attack on the budget announcement. With Labour leader Keir Starmer testing positive for COVID-19 an hour before the announcement, Shadow Chancellor Rachel Reeves took his place.
Never has a Chancellor asked the British people to pay so much for so little. Time and again today, the Chancellor compared the investments that he is making to the last decade. But who was in charge? Who was in charge in this last decade? They were. So let's just reflect on the choices that Chancellor has made today. The highest sustained tax burden in peacetime. And who is going to pay for it?
This is a big increase in spending for a Conservative government, so it'll be fingers crossed that the Office for Budget Responsibility is correct when it's predicting that economic growth will be quicker than expected. That's especially with the government's Plan B still lingering in the background. Jane Worrell, NTD News, London.
A new poll shows the British public wants a referendum on the government's net zero proposal. This will come as a blow to the Prime Minister just days before the COP26 climate change summit begins. According to a YouGov survey conducted between the 22nd and 24th of October, 42% of adults support a vote on the plan, 30% are against it, and 28% don't know. When the don't knows are excluded from the results, 58% want a vote. Of those who expressed a preference, more than half of every category supports a referendum. This includes Lib Dem supporters, Remainers, young people and Londoners. Among Conservative supporters, 58% think there should be a vote. Support is the highest in Northern England, where 2/3 of people want to vote. The polling was commissioned by a campaign group called car26.org. It is calling for a pause in related regulations until a referendum is held. Now ahead of COP26, we take a closer look at the decline in the UK's use of coal and whether this will impact greenhouse gas emissions in a global context. NTD's Joe Duguid has the story.
Britain, once a global leader in coal production, has moved firmly away from this primary energy source. Coal is one of the most important fossil fuels, along with oil and natural gas. It formed from vegetation and took millions of years, so it is classified as a non-renewable energy source. Coal output grew rapidly throughout the Industrial Revolution and peaked in 1913, but since then, and especially in recent decades, Britain's coal production has plummeted. Once used in industry, on railways, for gas production and to heat homes, it's now primarily used for generating electricity. One of the major reasons for the rapid decline is the pollution. Research shows of all the energy sources, coal has one of the largest negative health and environmental impacts in both long and short term. In 2015, the government committed to closing all coal-fired power stations by 2025, becoming the first national government to do so. But will it make a difference? There are currently only 4 coal-fired power stations still working in the UK. In 2019, coal accounted for just 3% of the UK's primary energy supply. The 3 largest consumers of coal worldwide are China, India and United States. China obtains roughly 60% of its power from coal and is the world's biggest source of greenhouse gases. China emitted 10.2 billion tonnes of CO2 emissions in 2019 from burning fossil fuels, almost double that of the US and around 4 times that of India. The UK emitted less than 500 million tonnes in 2019 and is reducing that figure year on year, according to provisional figures. China, however, hosted a coal and mining trading event on Tuesday. Speaking to British broadcaster Sky News, exhibitor Chen Qianbao said, "China can't give up coal totally and immediately," adding, "The country must ensure people's basic needs." Power outages in China were reported last month. Beijing is planning to build more coal-fired power plants, but says it still plans to taper its use of the fossil fuel. Chinese leader Xi Jinping is not expected to attend next week's COP26 summit in Glasgow. Joy Duguid, NTD News.
Protecting peatlands in the Midlands and Northern England is an effective way to reduce carbon in the atmosphere. These wetland ecosystems are natural carbon stores, so keeping them wet will help keep the carbon in the ground and prevent wildfires. Sustainable crops can also grow in re-wetted peatlands and have a variety of uses. Here's NTD's El Rose with the story.
On Black Ashop Moor in the Peak District, peatlands are at risk. Conservationist Christopher Dean's team are planting sphagnum moss. This type of moss can hold 20 times its own weight in water, keeping the peat wet and encouraging carbon capture.
Our peatlands in the Peak District here in the Dark Peak are about 7,000 years old. So it's old carbon, basically. It's old carbon. It's as important as keeping this in the ground here as it is important not mining coal and putting coal back into the atmosphere.
Peat is the surface organic layer of a soil that consists of partially decomposed organic matter, mostly from plant material. Peatlands take CO2 out of the atmosphere. The vegetation on top builds plant structures, and the carbon settles into the layers of peat that have developed over thousands of years.
So all of the carbon that the plant material is made up of, that's taken out of the atmosphere, then gets locked up into the peat.
Hotter, drier springs and summers are drying out peatlands, leaving them susceptible to wildfires. When fires burn them, carbon dioxide is released back into the atmosphere, reversing the environmental benefits. Besides planting moss, Dan's team are constructing small dams in natural gullies to stop the moorland eroding and to keep it moist.
We just need to stop the peat falling off the hill or disappearing into the atmosphere. We need to wet them up, and we need to get the right body of plants back into these places.
Eastward in the Fens, a pilot project is testing new types of sustainable crops that can grow in re-wetted peatlands. They have potential uses in food, industry and medicine.
So what we're trying to do here is demonstrate a new way that we could farm peat soils that will still bring in economic income for farmers, but actually trap that carbon in the soil with a new form of crops.
The project supports raising the water table of those fields to protect the peat and trap carbon. The team hopes the reed crop could eventually be dried, harvested and used for cavity wall insulation. Earl Rhodes, NTD News.
British Iranian national Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe has been imprisoned for 5 years in Iran. An Iranian court convicted her on charges of plotting to overthrow the government. But her family and supporters say she and other dual nationals are being held as bargaining chips. Now, her husband is on a hunger strike in central London. He's protesting a recent decision by an Iranian appeals court that upheld a verdict, sentencing her to another year. NTD's Malcolm Hudson talked to him to find out more.
Richard Ratcliffe, husband of Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe, started his fast here on Sunday outside the Foreign Office in central London. He plans to maintain a constant vigil by sleeping in a tent outside the office in the hopes of pressuring the government to secure the release of his wife and other detained British Iranian nationals. His hunger strike comes after an Iranian appeals court upheld the sentence of Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe to spend another year in prison, with an additional year of travel ban added. That means she wouldn't be able to leave Iran until 2023. Ratcliffe says he's concerned about his wife's situation.
I think it's precarious. I spoke to Nazanin this morning. She was worried, worried and restless and not able to concentrate. That's partly because she's waiting for a phone call to come back to prison, and partly because, of course, her husband is camping on the street. I mean, we've been held in a game of cat and mouse. Like, it's a fight between two governments now, where it's maybe release, maybe more prison, maybe nothing, for years.
He's got 4 demands for the UK government. One is for the UK to settle a debt it owes Iran. The other 3 revolve around challenging Iran on its hostage-taking, to recognise his wife and others as hostages, punish those involved, and to bring an end to hostage-taking for money or influence in negotiations with the West. Why does Iran think she was plotting to overthrow the government?
Iran doesn't think that. I mean, the Revolutionary Guards claimed it, but the head of the prison, when she was convicted, said, listen, this is a made-up case. The judge told her it was a made-up case. They picked her up because they wanted someone to use for leverage to get their money back, and that's what they've been very clear about.
Ratcliffe said the reason Iran took her was to be provocative and mobilise the British. So far, he says the government has not done much.
They have been using diplomatic channels to say to Iran that this is not right, you need to release Nazanin. At the beginning they're very cautious and they wouldn't criticise anything. Now they will criticise her sentence. But in terms of actually getting her home, in terms of challenging Iran's hostage-taking, in terms of settling the debt that's the issue between us, they haven't moved on those at all.
His hunger strike is a way to push the government to change its approach. 2 years ago, Ratcliffe went on a 15-day hunger strike outside the Iranian embassy. It's a move he credits with getting their 7-year-old daughter, Gabriella, released. He hopes the same will happen for his wife. Malcolm Hudson, NTD News.
Still to come, Afghanistan has 500 female lawyers and 250 female judges. But many of them are now being chased out of the country by the men they jailed who were freed from prison by the Taliban. We hear from a lawyer and a judge who escaped to Greece. That and more after the break. The Paris Agreement and Europe's Green Transition will be on the table for discussion at the G20 summit scheduled for this weekend in Rome. While the representatives of some European countries are supportive of new energy initiatives, economists have mixed reactions. NTD's France correspondent David Vives spoke to an economist who says this is a cancel economy agenda that may harm European nations to the benefit of China.
Can all G20 countries be climate neutral by 2050? The European Parliament said last week it will push an accelerated climate action agreement at the upcoming United Nations Climate Change Conference, also known as COP26, which is kicking off at the end of the month. One of the objectives is to cut CO2 emissions by at least 55% by 2030. But the transition will come at a price. The European Court of Auditors estimates that EU countries will have to bear the cost of over €1 trillion over the next 9 years. Economist Philippe Erlin published a study earlier in October called Cancel Economy: Why the Energy Transition is an Economic Disaster. He examined the costs of making the green transition and says the outcome might come at too high a price.
The objective of lowering CO2 emissions by 55% implies lowering the GDP growth by 2 to 3%. This means gas prices will increase. The subsidies in electric cars will be a really huge cost. And then there are subsidies for wind and solar panels.
The subsidies for the green transition will weigh heavily on taxpayers, who might suffer from inflation. Moreover, other measures pushed by the European Parliament might shake up the automotive industry, such as a transition to 100% electric cars by 2035. According to Erlin, this will be highly beneficial to China.
China never succeeded at selling cars in Europe. They never had the technology to challenge the European brands. Now China owns 80% of the rare steels that are necessary to build electric cars. China will manage the electric technology, so they will likely be able to flood the European market with Chinese car brands, while the car industry in Europe is devastated.
These measures are unfair, considering that Europe is only responsible for around 7% in carbon emission worldwide, compared to China's 28%. That's according to a 2019 report. Additionally, under the Paris Agreement, China isn't obligated to reduce its carbon emissions until after 2030 because it's classified as a developing nation. David Vives, NTD News.
After 16 years, Angela Merkel was formally dismissed on Tuesday as Germany's Chancellor. But the German president asked her to stay on in a caretaker role until a new government is formed. On the same day, the new German parliament came together for the first time, electing its new speaker. This story comes from NTD's Eddie Aiken.
Tuesday was Angela Merkel's last official day in office after 16 years at Germany's helm as Chancellor. German President Frank-Walter Steinmeier handed her discharge papers, relegating her to a caretaker role.
This is a legislative period that will certainly be marked by the pandemic in the memories of future generations. But many other things have also contributed to the political success of this legislature, not least the implementation of your political projects beyond fighting the crisis.
All members of the German cabinet from the coalition, consisting of Merkel's Union bloc and the centre-left Social Democrats, were formally discharged. They are now a caretaker government. Earlier in the day, the new German parliament, or Bundestag, came together for the first time. Angela Merkel watched from the visitors' gallery since she's no longer a lawmaker.
I welcome the Chancellor, Dr. Angela Merkel, who today is seated in an unusual place.
With 736 members, it's the biggest in German history. Lawmakers elected their new president of the parliament, or speaker, the third highest office.
I stand for the fact that we are developing a new closeness to the citizens in this legislative period, and not only because this parliament is made up of a remarkably diverse group of people.
The Bundestag is not scheduled to meet again until the election of a new chancellor is on the agenda. Olaf Scholz, who was dismissed as finance minister on Tuesday, is likely to succeed Merkel. His Social Democrats finished first in September's election and are in talks to form a coalition government with the two smaller parties. They said they aim to have the country's next chancellor in early December. Eddie Aitken, NTD News.
Staying in Germany, the presentation of a book on Xi Jinping by a well-known journalist was scheduled today at 2 Confucius institutes at German universities. But after Beijing allegedly intervened, the events were cancelled. One university is now considering ending its cooperation with the institute, calling the cancellation disconcerting. NTD's David English brings us more.
2 Confucius institutes in Germany suddenly cancelled the presentation of a biography on China's head of state. The publisher says this was due to pressure from Beijing. Xi Jinping can no longer be talked about as a normal person. He is now supposed to be untouchable and unspeakable. According to the publisher, Pieper, that's how an employee of one Confucius Institute explained the decision. The employee said they had received pressure from the very top. The presentation of the book, Xi Jinping, the most powerful man in the world, was scheduled at the institutes based at the universities of Duisburg-Essen and Hanover at the same time. In response, Leibniz University in Hanover, in a statement, called the cancellation unacceptable, disconcerting and incomprehensible. It is now considering ending its cooperation with the institute. The university said any attempt by foreign governments to exert political influence on research, teaching and public relations must be strictly rejected. The co-author of the book is the well-known journalist and publisher of the German newspaper Die Welt, Stefan Ust. He says China is trying to impose its values internationally, which are directed against our freedom. China's Confucius Institutes are set up in partnership with universities around the world. They have long been criticized for being the extended propaganda arm of the Chinese Communist Party. Human rights violations in China, such as the concentration camps in Xinjiang or the forced organ harvesting from Falun Gong practitioners, are not discussed at the institutes. Many institutes worldwide have already been closed or had their funding terminated. This summer, the Bavarian city of Ingolstadt decided to no longer financially support its Confucius Institute. The presentation of the new book will now take place directly at the University of Duisburg-Essen. Leibniz University has also offered to host the authors. David English, NTD News.
Taiwan's foreign minister said the self-ruled island is seeking to strengthen its defenses and gain more friends as he visited the Czech capital Prague today. It follows a visit to Slovakia where he emphasized the importance of democracy in the face of a pandemic. NTD's Joy Duguid has the story.
Taiwan's foreign minister led an official delegation to the Czech Republic aimed at boosting bilateral trade and investment. After meeting Czech Senate Speaker Miloš Vystrčil, Joseph Wu spoke of the escalated tensions between Taiwan and China, which claims the island as sovereign territory.
The situation is growing tense and seems to be growing more dangerous.
He noted the record number of Chinese planes entering Taiwan's airspace earlier this month. Wu said Taiwan has 2 strategies to strengthen its position in the face of threats from China.
The first is to beef up our defense capabilities. We think weakness is inviting aggression, and therefore we want to have the ability to defend ourselves, and we are determined to defend ourselves. And the second is we try to make friends around the world.
Wu arrived in the Czech capital on invitation from Vystrčil to honour the assistance that Taiwan gave the Czechs during the pandemic. Vystrčil awarded Wu with the Senate Speaker's Silver Medal for developing relations between the Czech Republic and Taiwan and for protection of democracy. The visit followed a stop in Slovakia where Wu made a keynote address at a post-pandemic cooperation forum. It comes as a Taiwanese trade and investment delegation holds meetings with Czech and Slovak business owners to boost mutual economic ties. Their visit to Europe has been condemned by China, which has threatened unspecified retaliatory steps. China has never renounced the use of force to ensure eventual unification with Taiwan. Joy Duguid, NTD News.
And finally, Dozens of women working in Afghanistan's judiciary have been chased out of the country by the men they jailed, now free from prison by the Taliban. They have been forced into a life on the run and living in limbo, uncertain about their futures and that of their families. NTD's Eddie Aiken brings us this report.
When the Taliban seized Afghanistan, Bibi Shaman Hafizi heard the militants were going door to door, hunting for people who worked for the state. So she burned every document in her home and went into hiding. Then she fled the country.
Our colleagues, the women that worked for the government, they are 100% under threat, as are our families who are still there. Only 4 of us got out. The rest of our family are still there. They are truly in danger. We are very worried for them.
Hafizi was on the run for 7 weeks with her husband and 2 children, moving between cities before being evacuated to Greece.
When the Taliban came, those criminals that were previously jailed were freed. With the Taliban coming, those criminals were released and women became trapped. We left with great difficulty until we got here.
Although the Taliban pledged to protect women's rights, advocates fear a backslide to when women were not allowed to work and girls were banned from school. Afghanistan has roughly 500 female lawyers and 250 female judges. Their work was dangerous even before the Taliban took power. Judge Friba Qureshi says Taliban intimidation was frequent. She says they would threaten to attack judges' homes and enter courtrooms. For safety, she prefers not to be seen. Qureshi was forced to leave Afghanistan when she could no longer leave the house and her children could not go to school. With her country plunged into deep economic crisis, few Afghans can imagine returning. Eddie Aitken, NTD News.
That's your news for today. Have a good evening. Thank you for watching our daily news show on YouTube. You can also watch our other programming on channel 190 on Sky TV or on Freeview via channel box on channel 271. In the meantime though, please give this video a like and hit subscribe to our channel. Have a good day.